Okay, so this module we're looking at the media, but we've called it multifaceted media. One, because there are different types of media to talk about, and two, because the approaches that they take to the reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues is also quite multifaceted. So multifaceted in terms of output, but also multifaceted in terms of discourse. Okay, so it's been argued that the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent, and that's power because they control the minds of the masses. So this was said by the African-American activist Malcolm X, but I think holds very true today because we see an enormous amount of examples, particularly trial by social media. And then what happens if you belong to a group that's marginalised? We see this situation described here by Aileen Morton Robinson. We have been portrayed as negligent and abusive parents, extremely violent, sexually abusive, corrupt, alcoholic, substance abusers and bludgers on welfare. And overall, it's this idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people suffer from some kind of cultural dysfunction. So when we have that kind of stereotype and we have that kind of discourse that operates, what we're going to start to see is that the media plays a significant role in society, and it not only reflects, but it also creates different types of relationships. It creates different types of fears and opportunities for different groups. So we really need to challenge these stereotypes and representations. Okay, so just looking here at a couple of different newspaper examples. We've got in the very centre there an ad that was placed showing Aboriginal children who had been removed from their families. Okay, we see other headlines there: blacks burn the Aussie flag, blacks find ways to get high. Very negative and provocative kinds of headlines, okay? But then we need to question whether or not we do consider our mainstream media provides us with the truth. Okay, so quote here from the media correspondent Jeff McMullen, who talks about responsibility, and talks about ways to show the truth. So when we look at journalism and cultural terminology, we can see that, some terminology might vary between locations, but that trying to develop an appropriate and accurate language is fundamental to ensuring non-discriminatory practice. Okay, it's really critical to creating positive relationships. Okay, so we wouldn't talk, for instance, today about people being half caste or part Aboriginal. Instead, we'd say Aboriginal people or an Aboriginal person. Okay, we wouldn't use some of those really negative and demeaning kinds of terms. We would capitalise some of our proper nouns. So a proper noun is always capitalised, like a name. So if we're giving a name to something, let's put it there in capitals, okay? But what we see is that in Australian media, that these representations of Aboriginal people really, in a certain sense, hold Aboriginal people hostage because they come to be seen as truths, and they deny people so many of their basic human rights. Okay, some of this happens as a basis of colonisation, and some of it has happened as an ongoing, feature of the experience in the nation. Okay, and what we start to see, though, in this fairly lengthy quote from Lois O'Donoghue that I'll let you read for yourself, is that Aboriginal people have become, far more politically aware And if not just becoming more politically aware, becoming very vocal in speaking out. All right. So we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are predominantly oral, but we do now, see a lot of these representations in the media being made in the printed word. Okay. And one of the things that we do need to acknowledge is that Aboriginal people, did pick up printed media as a way to get their point across, I think much earlier than people have really given them credit for. Okay. We also see a real need for sort of sensitive reporting in the media. So, things like suicide, mental illness and mental health are already challenging, but there's a real growing amount of literature on how to report that and how to speak about it in a way that's culturally affirming. Okay, we can also see that there are cultural protocols relating to deaths in community. Okay, so for some groups, for a period after a person passes away, they don't use their name, but they can describe them. Okay, so we see the front man from Yothu Yindi. It says Yothu Yindi frontman Unipingu dies age 56. So in that case, it's okay to use the surname because it's not just the surname of that particular individual. So you might also see them referred to, for instance, as Mr. Unipingu. But you won't see the first name and the surname used together because that marks out a very particular individual. I think that the Oxfam Guide on Cultural Protocols is a really useful read. So I'd encourage you, if you sort of, don't look at much else in the links from this from lecture, do have a look at that. But then there are other sorts of cultural protocols. So the ABC and SBS, and they're producing a lot more of the Aboriginal content than sort of your general pay-per-view TV. So it makes sense that, their guides are possibly more stringent. Okay. But then we start to see, media people who discuss, issues like Aboriginality. So we've got an example here of the journalist Andrew Bolt, who published an article called "It's So Hip to Be Black." Well, the newspaper published an article written by him. Okay. And I think particularly for some, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, that might seem to be quite upsetting. Okay. So taking here from work written by Gail Tillman, we see the analysis of the Andrew Bolt case. So it was that 9 high-profile Aboriginal people took the columnist Andrew Bolt to court, citing racial vilification over that particular article. Now, if you are interested, in following this further, there's a whole range of materials on the case. Okay, it was eventually found that the Racial Discrimination Act had been breached by the nature of what had been published. And, this then set in train a whole lot of public debate on freedom of speech, okay? But what has been argued to the contrary is that it wasn't about so much about freedom of speech as about conduct, manner, and the way that the articles had been written, okay? So, it's a really interesting example to follow up, all right? So in contrast, when we look at some of our Aboriginal forms of media, we see things like Away, and that brings you Aboriginal arts and culture from across Australia and also from, different radio broadcasters. So, it's a really interesting program to listen to, so you can follow that there with the link. In terms of news media, the probably the best known is the Courier Mail, which is a newspaper that's published from Lismore on the New South Wales North Coast. So established in 1991, so has quite a long track record now. Okay, so what we'll also see is different historical media that we can talk about. So with the sesquicentenary of the landing of the First Fleet, Aboriginal people in New South Wales and, some Aboriginal people from Victoria met together and published a newspaper called the Abo Call. And I think this is a really interesting example that shows us how terminology changes over time. But we can also see that in 1836, Aboriginal people, also prepared and published the Flinders Island Chronicle. Okay, so this is with Tasmania. Okay, and then we can see even earlier than that governments had attempted to provide, information both to non-literate Aboriginal people and also non-literate colonists, through some pictorial representations. Okay, so this is one example again from Tasmania, showing different elements of, I suppose, what we'd now call assimilation and then the imposition of colonial law. So the question, then could be posed, is our media the problem or the solution? And, that's, very much bigger than the scope of our course, but it might be something, that you would like to have an opinion on. So perhaps for your journal writing, do you think media is a problem or do you think it's a solution? So one of the things, I guess, when we look at media is being aware of our own prejudices and stereotyped beliefs, particularly those that come to us from our media representation. Okay, we need to be aware of the diversity of Aboriginal people, languages and communities. And we need to make sure that the stories that we tell are done in consultation with Aboriginal people, or really any marginalised group that we might be writing about. We need to think about, if a person has passed away, whether the way that we're reporting that is culturally appropriate or whether it is likely to cause more distress. And we need to be aware of correct terminology.